Thanks so much, everyone, for coming and for being here. Thank you so much to Ella and the entire organizing team for bringing us to this beautiful venue today. I'm here to kind of give the high level, like why are we building in DeSci, and then kind of give a really broad overview of the ecosystem, and actually go into the underlying tokenomics of why I think science can actually create really long-term sustainable value and also play a long-term role in crypto economics. Cool. So those who invest into crypto, I think we invest into crypto because we believe in sovereignty and liberty and open source access and in freedom of speech. And because kind of over time, something is being taken away from us slowly and silently. With that, I kind of mean like the underlying inflation that we've kind of experienced since, I think since about 15 years now, but that has really become rampant over the last couple of years, which has given rise in systems and belief systems like Bitcoin. And so fundamentally, I want to draw an analogy here and say that science and medicine today are really trapped in similar power structures. Biopharma is one example, but science more broadly, biopharma is often kind of deemed too big to change as an industry. Yet it consumes roughly 18.5% of US GDP. Roughly 9% of that alone goes to drugs and pharmaceuticals. And it's kind of entrenched in this 19th century era patent system and innovation system that has barely changed. And I think the analogy here to how the Federal Reserve actually controls our monetary supply, there's a very famous quote from Balaji who said, like, someone had to, in order to change the Fed, someone had to kind of invent Bitcoin. And that's what's gotten everyone actually much more actively talking about kind of the inflation that we're experiencing. Well, I think a similar thing is true for science, and it's why it's really an honor and pleasure kind of to work on this problem together, because I believe together, by really beginning to think about how science and medicine are trapped in similar power structures, can we actually change them? So science for the longest time has really been the progress engine for our civilization. But kind of that engine is stalling. So the productivity of research has kind of drastically fallen since the 1950s and 1960s. So are ideas actually getting harder to find? No, at the same time we hear about all this incredible innovation in science, biotech, all the time. So like what's really stuck? There's been huge budget cuts, specifically in the US. Mainly this year, but it kind of started over the last couple of years. And then at the same time, also biopharma venture financing is massively declining. There's a last interesting paper that was written that papers and patents are becoming less innovative and disruptive over time. Yet what we actually find at Bio and within kind of the DeSci ecosystem, there's so many people with incredible ideas that are like begging for funding. So this is a really famous quote that I've used kind of since the early days of DeSci, which is scientists spend about 80% of their time applying for funding and 20% doing the science. Aubrey and Caitlin, I think I actually asked you that question recently, and like to most researchers this is true. And if we think about innovation and progress, if you apply this analogy to like writing software code as a developer, it's actually quite striking. Imagine software developers had to spend 80% of their time applying to buy a keyboard, and could only, like once they got enough money to buy really expensive keyboards, actually kind of do the outputs of their work. And we have this fundamental hypothesis that most of the world's scientific talent actually remains untapped. A lot of some of the greatest scientists that we're seeing kind of come from atypical backgrounds, atypical universities. They're cross-disciplinary. And then if we look at the other side, if we look at the demand side, so this is something that treatments and actually recurring revenue dominate a healthcare system today instead of cures, right? We've kind of developed a system that needs lifelong customers instead of and disincentivizes actually finding cures. It's something we talked a lot about with one of the Dermada founders, is that, for instance, large skincare companies, they don't actually have an incentive to, like, for instance, curing acne, or like fundamentally revitalizing your face. They would rather sell you something that you kind of have to use every day, right? And so there's a fundamental disincentive here for innovation. Goldman Sachs asked us in a really famous report where they looked at a company that put a new hepatitis C drug to market, and they asked, is curing patients a sustainable business model? So like, this is a known fact, that it's not a sustainable business model. And hence, I think we need new business models that actually bring sustainability in. So we live in a time of science fiction and not of science fiction. If we kind of want to, Singapore actually very much looks like this, or you can kind of see the glimpses of it. Because it lives in, I think, in a much more progressive and sustainable state. And I think in order to get there, we need permissionless science. So a lot of what we dedicate our time to at Bio and at Molecule is permissionless science. Very broadly, what is DeSci? DeSci, for me, is a movement that aims to build public infrastructure for funding, creating, reviewing, crediting, storing, and disseminating scientific knowledge fairly and equitably using Web3 technology. We just had an amazing demo from Aubrey. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But for us, for instance, these bioagent and agentic systems are really good examples of this type of infrastructure. There are different kinds of DeSci verticals. So scientific funding and liquid IP, for instance, research communities and DAOs, publishing and reproducibility, and identity and reputation. DeSci is still a very new field. Many of you might be hearing about it today for the first time, in fact. And we're really only scratching the surface. So DeSci has been around, like, I'd say in the mainstream, like 3 years, right? I'm here today representing 2 organizations. One is Molecule. We had an amazing presentation from Aaron earlier. Molecule's goal, or Molecule is really a protocol for on-chain scientific IP, turning kind of siloed research data and siloed IP into open liquid markets. And then Bio, we just had someone ask about Bio in the Launchpad. I'll go a bit more into that. Bio is a curation and liquidity engine for on-chain scientific community. We bridge kind of DeFi and DeSci together and enable anyone to launch new BioDAOs, launch fundraise for individual research projects, or launch multi-agent systems. This is actually a slide from 2022, and it's one of the first IP NFT designs that came up. And what's really interesting is that a large part of this design is still being used. I think Kevin is going to give a really good presentation later in the afternoon, where he's actually going to present how this design is continuously being upgraded. But it's what I want to get to this next. It's really, we're still in a phase of building primitives. And so the IP NFT became one of the most important primitives. It essentially combines a legal contract, so a bilateral legal agreement, for instance, a sponsored research agreement. Typically, for instance, if for anyone that doesn't know this, if you're a large pharma company or a biotech company, you find a promising researcher, scientist at a university, you approach the tech transfer office, the scientist says, cool, I need to have a budget of 100,000, the university applies an overhead, you put it all together into a sponsored research agreement, and that kind of grants you now a specific amount of rights that result from that research. So that's how actually most of the active projects in DeSci have been funded. You attach that to a smart contract, and then you encrypt all of the underlying research data. So we often get asked this question, how can IP NFTs or IPTs actually be used for patents down the line? Aren't you fundamentally revealing the underlying research rights? And the answer is no, everything gets encrypted, but securely stored, and it becomes transferable on-chain. You can kind of think of this like a GitHub combined with a multi-sig. For anyone that uses multi-sigs in GitHub. Yeah, that's the gist of it. And then what we've done over time, we've created more primitives around this and more wrappers. And so maybe as a very general thing, once primitives are built, they can be infinitely used and freely used and openly. But they have to be refined continuously as shortcomings are discovered. That's typically how software primitives, for instance, develop. And so 2 things, I think in order for DeSci really to succeed, it needs to become data-driven. So we're looking forward to this continuous flow of data that actually flows into this. The original IP NFT was kind of quite static. And I'm looking at Kevin, he's gonna go into a new design later. And then it needs to become demand-side orientated. So this is something that Bio is paying a lot of attention to, is like who is actually on the demand side of the equation for specific research, right? If you're building anything in crypto, the demand side is incredibly important. I often ask this to my team, the question being like, who is the customer? The customer of any innovation or kind of any scientific product, well, should any kind of like scientific endeavor should ultimately be a product that helps people, right? And if you're tokenizing something, the token is kind of the intermediary there. And so we're looking at many new kind of legal and tokenomic designs, figuring out how, for instance, IP that is on-chain can be bought by another player and moved off-chain again, how that can generate liquidity. Vice versa, for instance, if a product is generating revenue. For instance, you saw some of the DermaDAO test samples earlier. I think it's really exciting actually to move into areas where you can have a direct-to-consumer focus and sell a product that someone can have in their hands today that provides value, right? And having those revenues flow back on-chain. So that's something that we're paying increasing attention to. So for anyone, again, that's completely new, at a very high level, what is a BioDAO? This was one of the other big primitives. BioDAOs kind of create value by building on-chain IP token portfolios. And so you have a DAO, a community of people that are dedicated to a specific research area. They vet and fund promising early stage research projects and through that generate IP. And that IP can then be monetized through a variety of ways and the proceeds flow back into the DAO's treasury. And through that you kind of get a sustainable funding loop. What I just talked about here, for instance, how this IP can be monetized, we increasingly see kind of DAOs or multi-agent systems like Aubrey, for instance, that are launching IPTs as like almost their research pipeline. It's like a tokenized research pipeline where certain parts of the IP can be sold off over time or it can be monetized. So we're seeing more and more DAOs that are increasingly launching more and more IPTs. And that just kind of gives the demand side more ability to bet on certain goals and certain outcomes. Here, a quick example. We heard a great talk about VitaDAO earlier. We should actually add Aubrey into this. These are some of the IPTs that VitaDAO has funded with some of the world's leading universities. VitaDAO also has quite an extensive equity portfolio. And then these are two of VitaDAO's leading IPTs. I'll talk about one just now to kind of give a brief example. But saying again, both of these, for instance, are in advanced talks with a major government around the world to progress into clinical trials. I think both have already filed for patents. And so like we're slowly showing the entire side of the value chain here. Actually, one of them, VitaRNA, is also in talks to develop a cosmeceutical. So increasingly, as time goes by, you can further monetize them in different ways. This is a kind of an ecosystem dashboard. We actually need to update the numbers on this. I think this is from summer still, but the total BioDAO community size is around 160,000. Ecosystem token holders are 28,000. Total tokenized IP value, I think this has gone up a lot. These are some of the live DAOs, agents, and IPTs that have recently launched. So Aubrey, for instance, we found this really interesting, quickly kind of took the third place. At the top place at the moment is HairDAO, a longevity dedicated to hair loss research. Found a lot of enthusiasts because it's direct to consumer. Second place is VitaDAO. I think if you actually counted, no, then there's VitaFast. And this is also, it's like a continuous leaderboard that goes up and down. What the Bio app actually enables you to do, if you hold any of these tokens, you can stake these tokens and earn Bio XP. The role of Bio in the kind of ecosystem is actually for Bio token holders to continuously decide and fund new projects that are launching on the Launchpad. This is one way to look at DeSci. If you took a very biotech lens, it's kind of this Royavan of DeSci. Bio represents a growing kind of portfolios of DAOs and IP assets and agents that are backed by cutting edge science. So if you look at Bio, we have all of the different BioDAOs in our ecosystem. Bio is often the largest token holder in many of them. And then they all each mint a variety of IPTs and IPNFTs. So I've talked a lot about IPTs. We think it's a really interesting design mechanism, so they can be exchanged for work, for funding, for contributions from the demand side. So this is a case study actually of how long, or like kind of the life cycle of how an IPT gets minted. So in May 2023, Artan Bio, which is actually introduced by a friend of Pfizer Ventures, of a friend of the MD at Pfizer Ventures. So Pfizer Ventures invested into VitaDAO in January 2023. They joined a lot of the research groups, and they suggested this particular project was at the time considered like a crazy moonshot. VitaDAO funded it for about 80,000, and from that minted a first IP NFT kind of see the research proposal here. This then created a first IP NFT. There's also actually an actual LLC that is attached to this in the US. And then next, in June 2024, so just over a year ago, there was, the DAO voted to create an IPT and kind of raise follow-on financing. Back then, this didn't run through Bio's Launchpad yet, but any of these upcoming sales would run through Bio's Launchpad. So what's interesting here, you can have a community that sources a particular piece of IP, and then once it's sufficiently progressed, so in this case, Michael Torres, the lead scientist, generated really, really good data around it. And then it raised $300,000 in follow-on financing, or total, yeah, it raised $300 in follow-on financing, and was follow-on tokenized for about 20% of the token supply. Then it got put onto a Uniswap liquidity pool in June 2024, and it stabilized at around a 3 million valuation. And kind of following all of the first continuous data drops, it's currently trading just over between 5 and 6 million FTV, which is roughly in line with an early stage biotech. And so we're actually, and like there's been enough price movement, all tokens that were issued then are freely tradable and liquid. What you have now is you have kind of these continuous data drops and community calls. You can join these often as a token holder. And the scientist has gotten really active on Twitter, and you can actually see how the data drops drive price discovery and price behavior around it, which we think is really interesting. Kevin is going to go more into this. So essentially, what you'll have over time, you have a continuous dashboard of new projects that are launching, and essentially building out a full liquid scientific portfolio. And so, because we spend a lot of time working in these different DAOs, working with universities, we began asking ourselves, like, what is really moving the needle here? On the one side, it's instant capital, right? It's the success cases of something like VRNA, where traders are actually increasingly starting to pay attention to what is happening inside each of the research projects. How can I gain an edge here? Like that are hopping from different research projects. The other part is essentially autonomous science. Like, how can we increase throughput? It takes a long time to source innovation from universities, and so we really began thinking, like, how can we agentify science? So we see this as one of the biggest primitives in DeSci are essentially scientific agents and multi-agent systems that automate core research functionalities for scientific communities and for scientific labs. So essentially, together with an agent, a scientific community, or it can be a group of friends in a group chat, can suddenly start having a relatively big surface area in a given scientific field. They can gather all their papers, and they can begin automating intellectual property discovery through continuous refinement. So what is the broad vision here? That bioagents can really generate thousands of hypotheses. Other agents rank, evaluate, design experimental plans, and prioritize the hypotheses. Humans then interact with these ideas and provide key feedback for rewards. And then capital allocation decides the most promising path in the open. And ultimately, traders then drive science from in silico to worms, to flies, to mice, and human trials. Want to give a small shout out here as well to Pump Science. So Pump Science is an early stage experiment that has directly built a kind of a discovery pipeline that goes from C. elegans to Drosophila and mouse experiments. And they've already funded, I think, over 60 different experiments just through a couple weeks of trading volume. And we're actually seeing this framework massively advance. So we already have communities now that are not just applying this for hypothesis generation, but also using the same graphs, decentralized knowledge graphs and people uploading frameworks to essentially build consumer-facing agents, right? So these agents can now not only like generate novel scientific hypotheses and experimental plans, but they can also, for instance, be used for personalized health advice, to an extent that a current ChatGPT or Claude or other models just wouldn't be able to. This was one of the first ones that we launched. We just had a presentation about it earlier, the digital twin of Aubrey de Grey. One thing that I'm really excited by is that this agent essentially is an active steward of one of the largest mouse rejuvenation projects. And if we can succeed at this, like these are the types of studies I think where DeSci can make a major dent in the world. It's like if we can, like I've always found this incredible, Aubrey. If we can double the lifespan of mice, like that's the type of thing that ends up in newspapers, and it's the kind of thing that gives us an enormous amount of novel, like basic science insights that the space can actually build on. And so one of the reasons why we got so excited about working with Dr. Aubrey de Grey was that coupling that novel data generation with an agent that can be prompted in the open, I think brings us much closer to open science than we've been in the past couple of years. We spoke a lot about this too. What I'm also really proud of is over $300,000 in fees that have been generated. If any of you actually want to check out how Aubrey works, what it does, just go on aubr.ai. And as the team alluded to as well, we'll have a lot more experiments coming this week. Test it out. Anyone can prompt Aubrey in public on X to generate novel hypotheses. These are some of the examples that we started having in the first couple of weeks. It's been incredible. I think by now we must have crossed the 3,000 or 4,000 hypothesis mark, or through POIs that have been generated in the public. There's a lot of refinement that is still needed here, right? It's like sometimes the responses are not as good, sometimes responses are being duplicated, right? So one of the next big steps that we're working on is actually making sure that each response is actively ledgered. Alex alluded to this. So this is the current bioagent hypothesis workflow. An agent collaborates on a hypothesis. This creates a proof of invention. These can be refined and progressed to IPNFTs. They can be then tokenized into IPTs to raise funding for completely novel research. Aubrey was 14x oversubscribed, and the launch since then has been really, really successful. It's trading at about 35 million FTV. And we've launched a series of new agents, or we're in the process of launching them. So Biome AI launched last week, dedicated to microbiome research. We also had another IPT launch focused on novel EDMT derivatives with the University of Florida. And I think we have 2 more presentations this afternoon by teams that are actively launching IPTs or agents. So we're slowly refining the framework, but also increasingly opening up the funnel. So in summary, we're building towards a world where scientists instead spend 80% doing the science, 20% applying for funding, a world where science becomes permissionless, self-sovereign, and autonomous, and where anyone can fund and participate in science independent of institution and geography. Thank you so much.